When single mom Nida Richards moved her family here in 2015, it felt like a fresh start.
If I would have known what I know now, I would have never came.
A shocking report from ProPublica reveals that black families are being needlessly targeted by the Department of Child Services in Arizona.
After she gave birth to her youngest daughter, hospital staff decided to drug test her. Richards says she didn't use drugs, but her daughter's test came back positive for amphetamine.
I just kind of lost it at that time. I kind of knew the end results of it.
A caseworker with the state's Department of Child Safety came to investigate.
That was stressful. That was beyond stressful. That was degrading.
Case records Richards provided to NBC News and ProPublica show it was found to be a false positive. Nationwide, black children are more likely than white children to experience a child welfare investigation and enter foster care. But Maricopa County, which includes Phoenix, stands out among the nation's largest counties with one of the highest rates of investigation for black families, according to federal data analyzed by ProPublica and NBC News. Between 2015 and 2019, more than 1 in 3 black children in the county experienced a DCS investigation.
So there is a lot to go into from this ProPublica report, but what we need to lead with is the simple fact that it has been a long practice of the United States of America to take away the children from black and brown families, and that fundamentally Child Protective Services has mostly done that throughout the history of the United States. Because let's get something clear. When white parents are abusing their children, it is very, very unlikely for any type of Child Protective Services to actually take the children away. Believe it or not, white parents can get away with a lot. And the reason for that is actually quite simple. Because first and foremost, a lot of people that work within these institutions, they will readily identify with and justify all the behaviors of any white parent that they see. They will easily take in anything as oh, they're just punishing their children or something along those lines. And they'll make up any reason why white parents should be able to keep their kids. But when it comes to black and brown folk, all of a sudden the calculation in their mind becomes different. Then all of a sudden, where people assume good faith and honest effort, people will intentionally misinterpret events, circumstances, you name it, as malicious neglect or something along those lines. And they'll even take things that are just a perfect example of hey, this person is financially struggling, and try and turn that into some sort of bad parenting. When the reality is that our system is just fundamentally failing to support parents with children. But this system gets even more sick when you actually start to realize that when children are taken away and given to foster parents are given financial support for fostering children. And that itself is a problem, because think about it. If somebody loses their kids because they're poor and they're struggling to feed their children, the solution is to give them money. So that they can actually feed their children, to make it easier for them to take care of their children. The solution is not to take their children away and give somebody else money. In a system, by the way, where we know that children who grow up in foster care are far more likely to deal with a huge amount of abuse, less likely to graduate high school, much less college, and fundamentally our foster care system is failing systemically. But the people who work in these institutions, they know. They fundamentally know this. This is more about racism than it is about anything else. Well, yes, there are some people that Child Protective Services actually do help. The harsh reality is that our systems are not designed to be helpful. They are designed first and foremost to be oppressive towards black and brown folks and also poor folks in general. But in this specific instance, it's definitely targeted way more towards people of color. And need I remind you of the United States' history of residential schools, of intentionally taking indigenous children away from their families and preventing them from even learning about their own cultures or speaking their own language? But it's even more infuriating with what this man says.
Do you think that bias is behind it?
It raises a lot of questions. I think we must always consider bias in our decision making, but there's a lot of other factors other than just bias that weigh in. If it was solely bias, then doing more training on bias would fix racial disparity.
You see, this man first and foremost says that it's not about bias, that if it was just about bias, then bias training would fix it, right? No, of course it wouldn't. Bias training doesn't actually fix the root problem. If the root problem is people working within these institutions being racist, these people intentionally choosing to not empathize with black and brown folks as human beings. Because if racism is at the core, you're not going to train somebody out of being racist by saying, here's how bias works, and here's how you might be being biased without realizing it, when a lot of these people are just overtly racist. They know that they're biased, they know that they're super racist, and they just don't care. Bias training is not going to solve that problem. You actually need to put in institutional controls to prevent racist individuals from working within these systems. You also need to fundamentally replace these systems with systems that are actually helpful, where if a social worker shows up at your house and they realize that you don't have enough money to feed your children, they should give you a check there on the spot to buy groceries for your kids. And they should continue to give you checks over periods of time to make sure that those kids are able to get food on their table. That's the solution. The solution is not to take children away, give it to other families, and give those families money. That's just ridiculous. But in Maricopa County, it is so bad that quite literally more than 60% of black children in Maricopa County will have Child Protective Services called on their parents at some point before they turn 18. And that is clearly indicative of not just bias, but very overt racism and malicious targeting of black families. And it's not just within these institutions, it's also within the school systems and within the neighborhoods, because Child Protective Services aren't getting called out of nowhere. It is racist nurses and doctors, it's racist teachers, it's racist parents, it's racist neighbors. We live in a country that is soaked in white supremacy, and the white supremacists that are out and about society are more than willing to call the police or Child Protective Services on any black family simply for existing around them. And in a world like that, it is the duty of these systems and these institutions to make sure that the racism of regular everyday people is not actually allowed to terrorize black families, at least from this institution. They should not be getting institutional support. Except for Maricopa County, it seems like they very much are. And that fundamentally, Republicans across the country are using the institutions of policing and child protective services as nothing but tools to terrorize black families needlessly. And that until we realize that, until liberals wake up and realize that, and fundamentally change how these institutions work, or replace these institutions with ones that are actually helpful, then this problem is not going to be solved. There's no internal policy change that will change this. There's no reforming the police or child protective services that will make these actually work. You have to fundamentally change how these systems operate at their core to be helpful institutions. You have to empower social workers to give government money to the people that actually need it. And you need to trust human judgment as opposed to this bureaucratic means testing nonsense. And we fundamentally need to stop letting white supremacists use these institutions as instruments for wielding power in their neighborhoods. But as long as Democrats across the board are willing to accept the word of these powerful institutions, we're never going to fundamentally get the structural change that we need to actually prevent the harms that these systems are propagating. Because even if you're a good person and you want to work within these institutions, you will find that the workplace culture is structured in such a way to prevent you from making anything better for anybody. And that even if you try your best to help people, fundamentally you will not be given the tools to help people in the way that you really need to. So as a society, fundamentally, we need to grow up and accept the fact that if families are struggling with poverty, that we need to support them with cash. And we need to stop means testing people. And we also need to recognize that a lot of these institutions have a lot of incredibly racist assumptions built into them. And until we change that, we are not going to get the change that we actually want or need.